There appears to be none.
Mr Chair.
I call Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Mr Chair, I must admit I'm a little bit more cynical than my colleague Grant Robinson here. I actually think what happened here, they have these things called rap wars. They're quite comical, and politicians going against each other. I think what happened here is it was Louise Upston versus Todd McClay. Todd McClay said the IRD wants us to go ahead. Louise Upston said land information can't deliver at the point in time when you want it, and there was a little bit of a war went on around who was the minister who was going to win out here. In fact, no, let's take it a level further. This actually has Stephen Joyce's fingerprints over it, if we're honest, because this really is a little bit of a mess, because land information, as my colleague has pointed out, land information, their land online system is actually acknowledged as one of the best in the world. It is an incredibly good system. It is held up by many in developed jurisdictions as the way to handle your sort of land transfer process. And so, as my colleague pointed out, to go to a point where they're actually going to, where lawyers and, well, it'll be lawyers by and large, have to register everything by hand on paper is an absolute nonsense. And I don't believe that land information actually said to the government, we are happy with the situation. I can't believe they said to their minister, this is acceptable to us, let's go ahead with this, it's okay, paper for 6 months, but we will cope. I don't believe they did that, because I know that a lot of people working for that ministry, for that department, are actually highly competent. So I think what happened is this was a dictate from way above, probably due to polling, because New Zealanders, let's face facts, New Zealanders are concerned about who is owning our land. There's no doubt about that. They are concerned about the bogeyman of foreign speculators coming in and taking away our houses so first home buyers can't get in. And so the government said, what should we do about this? We've got an idea. Went to Mr Joyce, because he tends to be the ideas man who doesn't think things through particularly clearly, and said, how about, first of all, we start collecting information? But the problem is, they didn't collect the information in a way that made any sense. The title of this bill is actually this act is the Taxation, Land Information and Offshore Persons Information Act. But it doesn't collect the level of information that is actually going to make any sense. And this is the thing that we simply cannot understand right across the side of the House. And I know Tim McIntyre, when he thinks about this, it's going through his head at the moment. He thinks this is a little bit of a nonsense. But unfortunately, he can't do anything about it. I know Mr Dunn, who is a former Inland Revenue Minister, must be looking at this and going, oh, goodness me, thank God I'm not in charge of this, because if you were, Mr Dunn, I know it would be a hell of a lot more robust than it is at the moment. Because I know Mr Dunn, the Honourable Peter Dunn, would not have allowed this sort of legislation to come before the House like this at the moment. Because, Mr Speaker, Mr Chair, it would have been so easy to collect the level of information that is required to provide meaningful data to the people of New Zealand, to the tax department, to everyone. But this is what is so astounding. It would have been easy to do, and we were quite happy to reach across in a non-political way with a solution that allowed it to happen. In fact, we suggested this at Select Committee. This was behind closed doors, so no one would have come out and gone, oh, Labor made this better legislation. This was a classic case of a Select Committee that could have worked together to create a piece of legislation that provided a level of information that actually made sense. But the thing about it is it's actually confusing. This is one of a number of pieces of legislation that's going to come through that's going to put effect to the government's policy. But the thing about it is confusing. In fact, it's so confusing, even the minister herself stood up and started talking about a bright line test when she was answering questions. This isn't about a bright line test. This is simply about collecting information. But the other problem I have with this legislation, Mr Speaker, and this is why the title is so wrong, because it does not reflect the Act in any way, shape or form, is in fact it creates what we call a moral hazard. And by that I mean, and this was brought up by the Green MP, by that I mean you only have to give your, a buyer and seller of houses only has to give their IRD number after the third transaction. And And one of the speakers stood up earlier and said, well, why do we think New Zealanders are actually going to do that? Mr. Chair?
Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much. Why are New Zealanders actually going to do that? And well, the reason that I get put forward is because it's actually the law. And we like to think that people will obey the law, but unfortunately, when people think the law is a bit of an ass or they can get away with it, or it doesn't really apply to them, then they won't do it, and that creates moral hazard, and that really concerns me. It's a sort of moral hazard that we all have, we all face. We're driving down the road at 56 kilometres an hour on a 50k zone, but it's okay, it's only a little bit over the law. This is the sort of legislation, this is the sort of bill that creates that sort of legislation. It's not really applicable to me. And there are also a number of tests in here that come back to intent. And this is the whole problem we have with this area of tax in this country. The other thing, Mr. Speaker, that is slightly offensive is the wrong word, but I could see how it could create a little bit of offence, is it actually classes New Zealanders who have been offshore for more than 3 years and haven't returned as offshore persons. So it puts New Zealand passport holders in a completely separate category than foreign investors. And I don't think that's right. In fact, it was queried in the select committee process. So again, we're talking about land information. That's why it's actually called land information and offshore persons information. Because when you think of offshore persons, you tend to think of foreign speculators. But no, this is about Kiwis as well. The other one, Mr. Chair, that was quite astounding, quite amusing actually, is the select committee process. We called for submissions, and there weren't that many submissions. I can't remember, maybe 10 or 12 who actually appeared in front of the committee. But 2 of the submitters actually talked about a piece of legislation that is coming after this one. The one that's going to be debated in the House, I don't know, next week, or I think the first reading was this week actually. And so even the submitters who had taken time, effort, energy, and no doubt quite considerable resources and money got it wrong when they were submitting to the select committee. And we actually had to sit there and because we went up to Auckland to listen to them. And we actually had to say, the points you are making are very interesting, but unfortunately it does not relate to this piece of legislation. And so, Mr. Chair, this, as my colleague Grant Robinson said, we actually agree in principle that something needs to be done. And we are backing this legislation, but the thing is it could have been so much better if we had worked together, thought a little bit harder about it, and actually come up with something which was much more robust. But as Grant said, the 1st of October, why is the government so fixated with the 1st of October? Is there something that we should know about that salubrious date? Is that the final of the World Cup, or is it the middle of the World Cup? I'm not too sure. But the fact that LINZ cannot even process the information online when this bill comes through just says that date is wrong. It would have been so much easier just to change that 15 to a 16, or I don't know, just work with LINZ. And the chair of the committee understands this. The chair of the committee, Mr. Speaker, was exasperated with the level of complexity where complexity didn't need to exist. The lack of efficiency when efficiency could have reigned supreme if only this had been thought through. But as I said, Mr. Chair, what I think this actually came down to was an edict up high that said, this is what must be done, now go ahead and do it. And the relevant departments couldn't actually meet the compliance in time for when this legislation came to the fore, but that is just the way it's going to be. It is not the way to craft legislation, and it could have been so much better. So who won? Did Louise Upson with land information win? Did Todd McClay with IRD win? Well, you know what? I don't think there are any winners. I don't think there are any winners. I don't even think Mr. Joyce is a winner in this, because as Mr. Dr. Clark knows, he's had dealings with Dr. Joyce's stuff up for a long time. And this just has his fingerprints. It really does, doesn't it? It really does. So there are no winners. So in the rap wars, I think it is actually zip. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair.
Dr. David Clark.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. It is with some, I guess,